So the context around today is that this is a webinar conversation, ultimately about inclusion. What we're going to be focusing in on is creating inclusive cultures, removing exclusivity barriers, unbiased talent attraction, and ultimately improving performance. A particular focus today will be around the Black Lives Matter movement. And our aim for this session is to enable you to gain a deeper understanding of what resources are available to you, insight into what other companies are doing, and ultimately how to get comfortable getting uncomfortable when discussing ethnicity. So to briefly introduce myself, my name's Darius Matusiak. I'm one of the regional managing directors at Macildowie, and my background for the last decade has been within senior level HR recruitment, senior and exec level HR recruitment. And ultimately our reason for putting this session on today was not just to raise awareness around a really important topic, but also because so many of our customers have been asking us questions that we don't ultimately have the answers to. Which brings me on to Martin Mason, who is the CEO and founder of Unleashed. Martin, until the last week or so, has been leading the global inclusion team at The Body Shop and has recently set up his own organisation, Unleashed, for multiple businesses across the globe to enable them to become more inclusive. So a big welcome to Martin and a huge thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, Darius. Appreciate it.
Excellent, thank you. So what we'll be doing today, as you have probably already gauged, is encouraging you to use the chat function. So please do share any ideas that you have and any thoughts that come to you during the conversation that we have. And just make those comments so that everybody across the whole group can benefit from us sharing the knowledge. We've had quite a few questions coming in to us in advance of this session, and we'll be using those to structure our conversation today. But as we move through the conversation, I'm sure that more questions will come to light. So please do put those in the chat function. And then what we'll do, given that we've tried to address the issue of having some time available at the end for it, is to answer those on the call. If for some reason we do run out of time, because we don't want to be keeping you much longer than the 60 minutes, we will make the commitment to come back to you individually and make sure that you are ultimately having your questions and queries answered. So I think we're good to go if everybody else is ready for us to start. So Martin, I wondered if you could maybe open the session by talking to us about what you think are the greatest opportunities for society to act on as part of BLM.
Good question. So I would say that the greatest thing that we can, there's a couple of things actually that we can do as society. And for me, there's kind of two aspects to this. So there's what we can do as individuals, but one of the areas where we can make substantive and significant change is through the organisations that we work for. Many of us work in pretty large organisations or have worked in large organisations, and that's an area that the world listens to. So governments and large institutions are often guided and shaped by what happens within big organisations, and by us operating differently as individuals, it systemically changes what happens within organisations, which inadvertently kind of changes society's view as a whole. So I see it very much as our responsibility as individuals to educate ourselves and to start the conversation. This isn't, rocket science. It's quite a simple thing when you boil it down, but it's just giving people the opportunity to engage in conversations and, as the webinar is titled, kind of get comfortable getting uncomfortable around some of these things and just learning.
Fabulous, I appreciate that. So with that in mind then, what is the role that businesses should be playing as part of the BLM movement? And how do you think businesses can ultimately help?
Yeah, so I think, kind of building on that earlier point, I think businesses can really be a force for good. Whichever industry or business you are in, you have a platform and a voice, and people will, respond and listen to your your views, your brand, it's something that people resonate with, and if you can make that voice strong and a force for good, then that kind of helps society as a whole. Using that platform to share commitments and be transparent about what you're doing as an organisation and where you plan to make change, that has a profound effect, because it's a bit like domino effect. We've seen that across the inclusion agenda over the last few years, but particularly with Black Lives Matter, as the movement has grown globally. We've seen, as more and more organisations have adopted a stance on this, others have fallen in line with that and started to really look at their own businesses and think about how they can make systemic change. And it's now getting the time, the attention, and the platform that it deserves. And that starts with, it's like all change, it starts with a handful of people that then grows into a movement that grows into a global change. So kind of succinctly to answer that question, I guess it's using your platform and your brand as a force for good.
Why do you think that BAME employees aren't well represented at senior level roles within companies?
It's an interesting, and BAME's an interesting term as well, because I think it's interesting, like when you start to unpick this and start to talk, we tend to talk quite broad brush around things like ethnicity and BAME, and it's basically a term to give people the opportunity to get comfortable using language around ethnicity. But I think when BAME becomes a bit of a catch-all for anybody that is non-white, and I have a real mixed view on, well, no, I have quite a strong view on this, and I realise that it's become a term that is utilised as an area for businesses to understand their non-white population, but even that in itself is quite unhelpful. And I think, classic example of that with the Black Lives Matter movement, it is about Black lives, and the reason for that is because if you take BAME as a kind of statistical group, it almost statistically it can look in an organisation better than it actually is. So black employees are particularly disadvantaged. All the data supports that. You've only got to look at FTSE companies in the UK as a starting point. The amount of black people that are on boards and are on senior leadership teams it's almost negligible. It's so small. We're talking, I think it's below 1%. Across the UK, and I will check that data. I know for senior leadership roles it was around 3% in the last census. So it is a real problem area, and I think until as business we can start to almost deconstruct this and look at what are the barriers, and why particularly black people are struggling to get into those roles. There's usually quite strong reasons for that. One of which is around people's talent management approaches. So most businesses use a very typical traditional talent management approach, something called the 9-box grid, which is where every employee is categorized into whether you are a high performer or a low performer, or whether you are a high potential or a low potential. And when you strip that back, it's a very subjective process, because what is potential? So often and those definitions come from a conversation with a senior leader where we say, do you think this person is high potential, high performer? Performance is more objective, because there's usually some sort of grading system or performance metric output. Yeah, and even that sometimes is a bit questionable, because it's often usually a traditional performance appraisal grade which has been assigned by a line manager, and there'll be a subjective element in there. But particularly with the potential, who are we to say what someone's potential is, unless you've got a genuine way of validating that around someone's capability or skills, which seldom in my experience of working with large organisations is that the case. So I think having those types of systems and approaches in organisations almost unintentionally creates a glass ceiling within businesses, because people recruit people and respond to people that are like them, and it's not until you actually start to put a data lens over the top of this and play that back to leaders to say, I don't know if you're aware of this, but all the people that you've identified are in this certain type of demographic. I'm sure it wasn't conscious, but there is clearly an unconscious bias there. Let's explore that and start having those conversations. I think probably a long answer to a question, but that is why I think businesses are underrepresented in those areas.
So with that in mind, could you talk to us about white privilege? What is it in your eyes?
Yep. So white privilege, there's quite a few definitions for white privilege out there, and you can Google these. In the easiest way I've kind of found to articulate this or to explain it when I've been talking to senior leaders or colleagues within businesses is, if you are white, you have privilege that you may or may not be aware of, but it is there. I am a white male, so I have the privilege of, my white privilege means that I am favoured in certain ways over somebody who is black, for example, in society. And it, because I am white, I am, statistically, I am more likely to get a senior role than somebody who is black, and that is my white privilege. It's not an intended thing, but it's a factual thing that I have privilege. Everyone's privilege is different, and so you may be privileged in one area but less privileged in another. So I am a white male, but I'm also a gay white male, and so my white skin gives me privilege in certain arenas, but my sexuality detracts that in others, for example. So depending on your intersectionality or your overall makeup, there's different levels of privilege within that.
Okay, so how can we use white privilege to help with the BLM movement?
So, given again that statistically there are far more white people in senior roles and executive teams across the UK and across the globe, therefore most decisions in organisations, the big decisions, are taken by the executive and the senior team, which to all intents and purposes are not representative of society. And what you get is this quite, again, unintentionally, this quite insular thinking. If you get a group of very similar people together, you get groupthink. So everyone's decision making is similar, and you find people affirm and validate others' decisions. Having greater diversity in the room means greater diversity of thought. So it allows for a greater perspective than we'd otherwise get. And the reason I'm explaining that is, if I think about how we can use our white privilege for those of us that are in senior roles, or for those of us that have a platform or a voice, it's about championing the people who do not get that that airtime or that platform, or using our opportunity to give other people the platform to have their voices heard, and bring them into the room to have those decisions made, so that we are more inclusive.
Great. And how can we all help add our voices to the fight during lockdown, particularly?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and it's one I've been asked a few times over the last couple of months, particularly as the Black Lives Matter movement has grown in strength and numbers, which is an amazing thing. It's very long overdue, and it's a real shame that it's kind of come up, like that the platform has grown in the way that it has, as in, the circumstances that led to that, and the deaths of black people across the globe. It's horrible. The one good thing that can come out of this now is, I think, because of COVID, more people are at home. There is more time generally for people to absorb things that, in the normal busyness that was before COVID, people just didn't really get the time or the visibility necessarily of some of the issues that face people of colour across the globe. So I think people using their voices, using their media platforms to be allies to champion people who don't have the same advantages. That's I think where the real magic can happen.
And are you talking particularly around social channels externally for that, as well as all of the internal work from a kind of a meeting perspective and everyday working perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we've all got social channels at our disposal. We've got LinkedIn. Most people are on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. It's getting part of the conversation. When you see something that is wrong, calling it out. We've seen some amazing examples of that. So there was a really great one that I saw a few weeks back with Yorkshire Tea, where somebody posted on their social channels, a customer posted a racist comment, and the other customers took to social media to kind of say, actually, this is not okay. and calling people out on it, and making sure that that kind of behaviour doesn't go unchallenged. And Yorkshire Tea actually wrote back to the customer and basically said, "Thanks for your view, but don't ever buy our tea ever again." You know, that's using your brand for the good and saying actually that we're not cool with that, and if that's how you feel, go and shop somewhere else, because we don't want your customer if that is your view. You know, having that type of strength in numbers around these things means that we can make genuine change in this area.
And what's your personal position on Black Lives Matter?
My personal view is that, so I've been a supporter of Black Lives Matter for quite some time, a good number of years since I became aware of it. I think my knowledge and education around it increased significantly about 3 years ago. So I appreciate in some ways I was quite late to the party, but my work through Body Shop and working with the global team there, and speaking to colleagues across the globe and listening firsthand to their experiences really opened my eyes to the level of racism in society. And I'm not talking about the explicit, like, you know, over, you know, really strong racist comments being said to people. We can all see that stuff. We know it's there, but it's almost like the death by 1,000 cuts type of racism, the subtlety around it. I hadn't realised at the time just how prevalent that was in almost every part of my social circle, in my network. And I think as white people, we become a bit desensitised to it. And, you know, I grew up in the Midlands. I came from a very working class background and working class family, and was exposed to racism on a daily basis. And at the time, I was kind of almost oblivious to it until I was educated around it. And then once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it's horrible. Like you just think, how can people operate like that? And I think so many people who do it unintentionally, that we all kind of have a responsibility now to educate ourselves and say, do you know what, this is not okay, and it's never been okay. But the Black Lives Matter movement for me really helped to educate me, to make me realise that, you know, being an ally is not being passive when somebody makes a comment and kind of ignoring it, but having your own personal view. It's being, you know, actively anti-racist and calling things out and saying, no, actually that comment, you know, I know you, so I know your views, and I'm sure you didn't mean it in that way. However, what you said was actually, you know, really offensive, or it's really not cool. So you need to go and educate yourself around this, or, you know, you need to think very carefully before you open your mouth around certain things, because it's not okay to say those things or to have those views or those comments to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And why do you think businesses took as long as they did to start responding to the movement?
I think it was a real mirror holding exercise for many companies and for many people in society. I think there was a lot of, I think it was interesting watching. I'm always fascinated with psychology and people's behaviour. And when you see people getting really uncomfortable, it's usually because, you know, research tells us it's because they're operating from a place of fear. And they're usually fearful because it's something that they don't understand or they feel very uncomfortable with. So people have, you know, quite strong adverse reactions to that. They either go immediately extroverted and go, I'm not racist, here's a reason why I'm not racist, and here's 10 reasons for that. Or they go within, almost like the tortoise within a shell, and say, actually, I either don't want to partake in this, or I need to educate myself around this before I have a view or an expression. And I think we saw a lot of organisations do that when the Black Lives Matter movement really took hold globally. I think there was a lot, you know, speaking to people in my network, there was a lot of businesses that felt really uncomfortable at the idea of having a conversation, and they were looking around the boardroom table, albeit virtually, and seeing a sea of white faces and thinking, well, how can we talk to that? But I think rather than, you know, face into that and say, actually, we've got it, you know, we're not representative, or we've got it wrong, or we don't know, and going out and talking to people, there were some businesses then started to talk on behalf of Black people, which was, yeah, it was quite cringy to watch, thinking, you know, have you actually spoken to anybody that is impacted by this movement? Because how do, you know, I'm not a Black person, I've not got the lived experience of a Black person living in the UK or traveling across the globe. So I think again, it comes back to education. It's about understanding and finding out what that looks like, so we can put ourselves in other people's shoes and start to think, right, well, would we be comfortable being treated that way? And if the answer to that's no, then we have to do something about it.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's think about diversity in general across larger organisations. How are we going to improve on this?
It's a really interesting area for me. So inclusion is a massive passion area of mine. I've always, through my professional career, I've kind of spent most of my time in retail organisations, kind of from grassroots, and working initially in the kind of the talent L&D space. And that was kind of my first foray into inclusion, because I always found it really interesting that in businesses we kind of set, particularly large businesses where you've got quite big HR or people functions, you tend to have like an inclusion lead and recruitment and L&D and all the different separate entities. And although they work together in the same team, inclusion tends to be its own little piece, talent tends to be its own little piece, and often they're not completely joined. I think having that kind of joined up thinking and looking at kind of the organisation as a whole systematically and saying, okay, what is the experience of a colleague coming into this business? If they are gay, if they are black, if they are female, if they are non-binary, how do I experience that? I'm really going through that kind of end-to-end, almost employee life cycle experience and seeing, okay, the different touch points. How would I feel if, being addressed in, X way, if I were in any of those different demographics? And I think once we start to do that, that's when you start to get that real shift and that real change within the organisation.
I think what you're getting at here is a form of psychological safety, aren't you? And I'd be interested to know what the role of the line manager needs to be in that. Perhaps you could give some key insights as to where you've seen it work really well in organisations.
Yeah, definitely. So I think as a line manager, and having been a line manager in an organisation, what I've always tried to kind of practice what I preach around this area. So looking around the rooms when you're in there, whether it's with your direct reports or with your team, or when you're, if you're managing or leading a function, looking around that virtual or physical room and saying, okay, what's the representation like in this room? Is everybody in here white? If so, how on earth, when we're making decisions about our business, can we be representative of our black customers, for example? So that's the first thing you can do, is kind of almost take accountability and say, right, okay, if I'm leading this, where am I getting my information or my my discussion kind of points from in those areas? I think the next bit is to then look at your team and look at, how representative or inclusive your team is. The third for me would be around the conversations you have with your people, creating psychological safety, as you said, and that kind of inclusive culture within your team where people feel they can bring their whole selves to work. Can they be their authentic self at work, or are they covering or masking part of themselves? And I have had that experience in organisations. I've worked in some organisations where it absolutely was not okay to be a gay man openly. Like, it would have been, at the time, it would have been, career suicide for me to have been open about my sexuality. So there was always a part of me that felt like I was holding something back when I was at work. When I went into organisations where I absolutely could be my authentic self, my performance increased tenfold, because I was no longer having to worry about, the little side conversations I was having at the coffee machine, or casual chats about, what did my weekend look like? What did you get up to last night? All those things. Instead of having to almost create a story of, rather than saying I was at home with my partner, you almost have to create these artificial stories in your mind, so that, and then remembering all these stories that you've told people, so that you can kind of maintain this kind of veneer, I guess. And when you can, as a line manager, when you can create a culture or a safe space for people to be themselves, they don't have to worry about all that baggage. They can just channel all that effort that they're expending into their work, and all of a sudden their performance and productivity goes through the roof because they're relaxed.
Yeah,
it's not a problem for them to be themselves.
Yeah, it's almost like the key components of high performance being psychological safety, and then the trust that then is created within the team, because it is safe enough to challenge each other, it is safe enough to seek to understand, and performance starts to improve.
Yeah. And I think the other bit that line managers can do is to be a really effective role model or ally, and to, when they see things that are not right, or that are, you know, with best intent maybe misguided in an organisation, is speaking out and challenging that, and being a voice for their team and their people to say, you know, I've observed this, and you know, I think we can do better.
Absolutely. You've talked a lot there about what organisations can do, and you've talked about your passion for the movement of BLM and diversity in general. I'd love you to share with our audience what you've actually done specifically as well. So could you give us some key insights as to what you've done and what's really worked?
Yeah, of course, no problem. So as I think we kind of touched on earlier, so the last probably 2 to 3 years I've spent at the Body Shop as their global talent and inclusion lead, working with people across the globe to really examine almost forensically what the culture, the practices were like, where the barriers to entry were for people. And I was incredibly lucky to work in that organisation and with that team. So they're a very progressive business. They really, really care about their people, and they really wanted to do better. And it was so nice and refreshing to work with a board of executives who were very open and said, you know what, we know we don't get stuff right all the time, so we really want to learn, and we want to be better advocates and champions for people in society that are not well represented. So through that, we worked with them to do audits. So auditing kind of inclusion as a whole, but each different demographic. So looking particularly at ethnicity, looking at gender, looking at LGBT+, social mobility, disability, and spent a couple of years kind of really getting under the skin and finding out where the pain points or the barriers to entry were from kind of recruitment, onboarding, development, and identified like specific areas where, you know, if you were a Black employee, or if you had any physical disability, or if you were a female, where you were disadvantaged. And we were able to, once we'd done that kind of groundwork and pinpointed the specific areas, we then sought to put the changes in place. There is literally so many that it would be hard to list them in this webinar, but I'll give you some like real tactical.
I was going to say, if you could give a couple of specific areas, it may help other organisations home in on those if there is a trend to be had.
Absolutely. So I think a really quick example would be, and this, old people often think this means spending like absolute tons of money to do this stuff, and it really doesn't. Sometimes it is just, you know, taking a good hard look at the business and walking through it almost through the eyes of somebody. So, you know, what are your toilet facilities like? So if you've got people that are non-binary or are trans who don't identify as male or female, you know, when they go to use the restrooms or the bathrooms, what does that look like? Are there only male and female toilets? You know, have you got a transitioning at work policy that means that if somebody is transitioning sexuality, that they can do that comfortably and feel supported to do that? When customers shop on your website, what gender options do you give them? Is it male, female, or is it, you know, non-binary, or prefer not to say as well? Like often I've shopped with so many companies where it forces you to choose a gender or a title that might not fit me. You know, looking at your even simple things like I remember vividly getting my onboarding pack in one of my previous roles and getting a pension pack, for example, and it said in there about something to do with like onboarding my wife as part of my package, and I remember thinking, I don't have a wife. So it's the subtleties around that, but when you get every single instance of that through your organisation, after a while it makes you feel as an individual like, I don't fit here because I don't fit that demographic. So it's all those little subtle changes that you can make. Things like your careers site, looking at that and saying, you know, is it representative? If you know, the language used in your job descriptions must hit the ground running. You know, basically implies that, you know, there's no kind of real time to get onboarded, or, you know, must be tenacious, must be a real go-getter. You know, Harvard have done studies on this that prove that women are far less likely to apply for a role if it has got those phrases in than male candidates.
Yeah.
So it's doing all the work around these subtleties within your business to really start to make genuine change.
Yeah, understood. Fantastic. Could you talk a bit about intersectionality and why it's important? Why does it matter?
Yeah, of course. That was a good question from someone. So intersectionality is, it's basically a way of saying that when we can't really put everyone in boxes. We're not just, you know, male or female, or, you know, we're not just a certain type of gender or a certain sexual orientation. We're a makeup of lots of things. So, you know, classic example again. So I am a white cisgender male, and I am also gay. And from a socioeconomic perspective, I've come from a very low socioeconomic background. So that is me as a whole. That's the intersectionality when we talk about that. It's almost the component parts or the jigsaw pieces of the puzzle that make up a human being. So I'm not just, you know, in that box there. And I think sometimes we tend to kind of group people together and band them in communities, and it's almost, that's where they then stay. So, you know, I remember having a conversation with somebody when we were setting networks up in a business, and the same person applied to be part of the ethnicity network and the gender network. And I remember someone flagging to go, well, which one do you want to do? And it's like, well, why can't they do both? they're a female and they're also black. Why do they have to pick, you know, which community they want to be part of? They're both of those things. That you can't just compartmentalize people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the round is intersectionality.
Fantastic. So thinking a little bit more around resources that are available for people listening in today, where can they learn about this sort of stuff to be able to ultimately roll it out in their organisations as effectively as they possibly can?
Yeah. I'd say just start really small and pragmatic. So things like gender terminology, brushing up on things like that. So, you know, Google's a fantastic tool. It's free, and you can find all sorts on there. So finding out what, you know, if you hear phrases that you don't understand, or you think, well, what did that mean? Like cisgender, or when you see the use of pronouns on the bottom of emails, or you hear people talk about genders that aren't, you know, male or female, Google it and have a look and understand what that means. There's some amazing free resources now around the different areas within inclusion that you can get. So TED Talks is often a favourite go-to of mine, a 15-20 minute TED Talk or podcast you can listen to that gives you information around this. Netflix have got some great series on there at the moment and some great documentaries to really help people understand about how they can, you know, get more comfortable in talking about trans awareness or ethnicity. So Disclosure on Netflix is a great program that talks about, you know, lived experience of somebody who is trans and black in the UK or the US. You've got 13th, which is a great insight into the US kind of racial inequality. You've got Why I'm No Longer Speaking to White People About Race as a book. You know, there's so many resources out there now. It's just kind of getting started with a couple, and you'll find that the thoughts start to kind of percolate from there.
And any thought leaders that you would recommend as well?
There are some really great people in this space. So if I think about some of the key ones who I've been particularly impressed with, who are far more eloquent than I when it comes to talking about this stuff. So John Amici is a great person to reference, has the most insightful talks. He's absolutely everywhere at the moment as well. So on LinkedIn, you won't struggle to find clips of John Amici. He's got some wonderful stuff around ethnicity in particular. Stonewall are a very good source of reference for people looking to get support around the LGBT plus arena. Disability confident employees is another good one for organisations to look at if they want some help on how they can become more disability friendly. And business in the community is another good one for people that want, they're quite generalist in their inclusion work, but particularly good in things like the Race at Work Charter for Ethnicity. So I know they're not specific individuals, but in terms of like general thought leaders in this space, they tend to be at the forefront of what's going on, and can certainly signpost you and put you in touch with the right people to do some great work.
So bringing this part of the webinar to a close, what advice would you give to people listening in today then?
Um, I would say, again, I kind of education is a key theme throughout this. I think just going and doing a bit of research. It is not on, it's not on people in, I hate the term minorities, but in kind of non-majorital communities to do this work. So if you are a straight person, it is not for gay people to educate you around the LGBT plus community. If you are a white person, it is not black people's jobs to educate us as white people. The resources and the education and stuff are out there. It's just a case of putting a bit of time and effort in and doing some of the work on it. So I think that's a good starting point, is going out and getting educated around this, and doing that, having that, even just a basic level of education around this, will give people more confidence and comfort to have conversations and get a little bit more uncomfortable. The other bit of advice I would give you is to just have a good look at your network. There's so many of my, particularly my Midlands friends, that have contacted me over the recent weeks in response to Black Lives Matter movement and have said, "Oh, I'm not racist. I've got loads of black friends." And I'm like, "Okay, brilliant. So when was the last time that you actually thought about? Did you say, for example, when Black Lives Matter movement happened, did you call them and ask them how they were? And why would I do that?" I said, so every time something happens like that, this triggers a level of trauma or PTSD for people, because they've got, these lived experiences. They know what it is like to have that, that threat on their life happen, which we take for granted that we don't have walking down the street as a white person, for example. So, reaching out and supporting people and getting educated, for me, would be the top two things that I think will make a genuinely better society for us all.
Fantastic. Okay, great stuff. We've had a number of comments and questions come into the chat function. Has kindly gathered for us. So I wondered perhaps if we could work through a few of those now. So Reese, thank you very much for your input. Reese has said, "Can we please separate D&I from BLM?" I wondered if you could just extrapolate that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, I think we have to be really careful with this, because D&I becomes a bit of a catch-all for everything, and which is one of the reasons why, when we do the work we do, we kind of talk about inclusion. It's very, very rare you'll hear me talk about diversity. Occasionally you get the odd slippage, just because it's almost ingrained from corporate life. But for me, our focus is always around inclusion. So it's being able to create an environment where people can be themselves. It's not about having a specific representation of certain people. And within that, you then have to break that down to start looking at the different areas within kind of the inclusion sphere. So looking at all people. So what does it mean for me if I am black? What does it mean for me if I am, bisexual? What does it mean for me if I have any form of disability or neurodiverse condition, for example? So I think all of these have to be broken out. I don't think it should be kind of lumped in together. I think Black Lives Matter specifically needs to be brought out. I completely agree with that comment. Did a great piece of work with the Body Shop around specifically that, like breaking that out and making sure that it got the airtime and the focus and the attention that it deserved, so that it didn't get buried within kind of the world of inclusion. And I think particularly, again, data proves that the black people are the most marginalised people in corporate life. So therefore, why wouldn't you spend more of your time and attention there than any other area of inclusion right now? Because it's where you can make the biggest difference to people that have suffered for far too long.
And what would you say on that note then to those that would say, would you be stepping into the territory of some kind of positive discrimination there?
This is a really good question. I've been having quite some debates with some of my HRD friends in this space. It's not about, for me, I don't think you have to positively discriminate in order to address the inequalities for people, but it's about creating a fair and equitable system in the first place, in order that, because I am black or because I am gay, it doesn't mean that I am at a disadvantage. So it's about leveling the playing field, so to speak. You know, getting your talent system right and making it inclusive, for example, means that you fix the root cause of the problem, and allow people to flourish within the organisation. It removes bias from the process. Body Shop have done that with great success over the recent months, and they've seen the imbalances start to be addressed around black people getting promoted, for example, within the organisation. So I think that's not positive discrimination. That is just removing the barriers from people so that they can flourish and progress in the same way as everybody else.
Fabulous. Another question for you. So thank you very much, Chris Buckley. Chris said, I think the label of BLM has made many boards of organisations nervous to participate with the movement due to the political implication and fear of a backlash. Could you comment on this?
That's insightful. I do understand. I have seen that. I have seen that within organisations, and through conversations I've had with people in my network, I know they have felt fearful. I'm, as you can see, I can wax lyrical about this stuff. I will challenge quite hard on that with people to say, well, okay, talk to me about that discomfort and that uncomfortable feeling and why you're feeling that and what you're doing about it. So it's not enough to just say, oh, I feel uncomfortable about it, therefore I'm not doing anything about it. It's, okay, I feel uncomfortable, which probably suggests that it's an area I'm not informed or know enough about, so I need to go and get informed. It's interesting, the political element to that. My lines are probably, you know, being really authentic and honest, my lines are probably a little bit blurred on that. You know, Body Shop isn't, as an organisation, for example, is not frightened to lobby governments or be political if it's the right thing to do. And I suppose for me, if we strip that back, I would almost be inclined to take the political aspect out of it for a moment and think about, is it doing the right thing? Because doing the right thing makes the political aspect to it almost irrelevant. And I suppose if you can look yourself in the eye and say, I'm doing the right thing around this, then that's great. But if you can't, then I think that you have to kind of look at that and go, okay, well, why is that then?
Fabulous, thank you. A question from Leanne. What is a better alternative to a 9-box grid for potential or talent?
Great question. So I've spent the last probably 5 years of my professional career in-house railing against the 9-box grid for that very reason. So there are talent approaches that you can use that are more effective. I have designed my own in the past, and I'd be very happy to share those with anybody who wants information on that on this call. Technology can play a massive part in doing this, because once you start to automate parts of your talent process, it immediately removes kind of the subjectivity element that you have. Well, in by and large, I appreciate the technology is built by people, so therefore, you know, we're being completely scientific. There's of course an element of it, but it removes the majority of biases that we make on people. So think about how we did that at Body Shop. We put a technology platform in place, and we use that. Once we've got very clear criteria about what we needed, we use that to start to select people for positions, roles, opportunities, secondments, versus getting in a room and saying, you know, what do we think of Bob? Is Bob really good at this? Or Sarah, is Sarah any good at you know, these? Do we think Sarah could be the next leader? They're just such subjective questions, because my first challenge as a former head of talent would be to ask, well, what does good look like? And let's be clear about the criteria. Taking away the labels around talent can be really helpful. So if I had £1 for every time I'd heard things like, yeah, I think, you know, that person's not quite ready yet, but they'll be ready in 2 to 3 years. And it's like, okay, amazing. What's going to change in the next 2 to 3 years then? Well, they'll have more experience by then. Brilliant. Experience in what? So what is the gap that you see from now to there that is the roadblock from Sarah getting that job? When you start to then pin it down more, they either go, well, I'm not entirely sure, and it's like, well, maybe we should explore that and find out what it is, because then we can say to Sarah, here's the development plan. You know, if you want to be a general manager, you need marketing experience. You don't have that right now, So let's look at how we can get you the marketing experience, which removes that barrier for you, rather than just, yeah, they're, you know, they're really good in that role, but I'm just not sure I see them as doing this. It's like, what does that even mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so putting that kind of technology platform, or that even, you know, if you haven't got the money to invest in something like that, just putting almost a framework of that in a manual perspective in place, which again, be very happy to talk to people about kind of the pragmatic element of how you could go about doing that. But that's where you start to see the real difference in systematic talent change.
Excellent. Ben, Ben Leroy, would you be very kind enough to comment in the chat if that has also answered your question, which was around removing limiting factors and identifying what those factors are? I believe it does, but if it doesn't, please do comment and we can revisit it. I've got another one from Chris Buckley here, who said, it feels like the acceptance of LGBT staff in organisations has happened faster than BAME/HOP. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think this is?
I mean, reflex action, I immediately went yes, but then I paused actually, because I partly agree with that. So I think that gender and the LG aspect of LGBT have definitely become more socially acceptable, and the data around that suggests that. And there's been, you know, lots of media focus and organisations doing work in response to things like gender pay gap, and, you know, organisations participating more in Pride. Not that that's the only thing, but it's, you know, with that external commitment and partnering with organisations like Stonewall, we're starting to see real growth in that area. I would disagree that bisexual and trans people it's been progressive for. I really don't feel it has. I could probably count on one hand the amount of conversations I've had, the amount of organisations that have had conversations with me to say that they've got that right in-house, that their facilities are set up for people, that their programs, their data points, their systems are inclusive of those people. So I'm kind of erring on the side of caution with that one. For again, BAME being a bit of a catch-all, it's a difficult one. I think, you know, if you are you know, again, data proves if you are Indian or are if your ethnicity is Indian and you're in the UK, you are at more of an advantage than a black person would be. So again, I think BAME can be quite an unhelpful term. But I think, yes, generally as a whole, ethnicity in most organisations is quite far behind gender and LGB or LG.
Thank you. Really interesting question from Anna Jarrett Rawlins here. I'd be interested to know if you've run any organisation-wide workshops or training to change culture that is not just based on leadership. Have tips of how to talk to colleagues about this, it would be really useful.
Yeah, just thinking on that one for a second. Yes is the short answer, I have. And trying to think which ones would be most useful and effective, because there was quite a lot of programs that we did. We have done with Body Shop and are now starting to do with other organisations around this as well. Sorry, Darius, just to replay, the question was more around equipping people to have effective conversations. Have I got that right?
So I'm interested to know if you have run any organisation-wide workshops or training to change culture that is not just based on leadership, was the question. And then the comment was if you had any tips how to talk to colleagues about this, it would be really useful.
Yeah, sorry, it took me a minute.
No worries.
Okay, so yes, I would say, so we've done that around, particularly around gender, disability, social mobility, ethnicity, and LGBT plus, and broken down the LGBT plus and the ethnicity within that as well. And it's about giving people like the toolkit and the resources to have conversations around things so that they've got their terminology correct, so they're not insensitive when they enter into those conversations. That's quite critical, and you can do that with all colleagues. And it's quite easy to pull guides together on those types of things and circulate them out and give people resources to go and educate themselves around. I do think it's really important to do things with all colleagues, but I do think that there does need to be an emphasis on the leadership side, because I think when you do the two in parallel, you need the leadership to change the direction of the organisation and unlock that culture at the same time as your colleagues getting educated at kind of at the bottom up approach. So I think when you do the two in tandem, that's when it's most effective. If you just train your colleagues and don't do anything with the leadership, they then find themselves coming up against barriers because they start talking about it and they get shut down by their leaders. So I think there is a need for both.
Okay, fabulous. We've got a few more to go and we've got just over 5 minutes left. So Leanne Long has asked, do you have any tips for how we can have uncomfortable without fear, given that fear is seldom a good springboard for change?
That is a good question about how do you do it without fear. Aside from the education piece around this, I think when you become educated around it, there's a level of comfort which removes the fear. But I wouldn't see that the fear is, it's interesting perspective on that. So I don't find fear to be an unhelpful characteristic. I think sometimes it's quite helpful to have a little bit of that, or to be courageous and have conversations when you feel a little bit uncomfortable, because that's where the real learning comes. If we're comfortable about everything and we talk about, or if we talk about everything because it's from an area of known, we're not learning anything. So, you know, asking people about their lived experiences can be a bit uncomfortable, but if you're actively listening and you take it in and you learn something from it, even if you feel a bit uncomfortable, that's got to be a good thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Couple more to go. Chris Buckley, BLM should be a work stream within D&I, shouldn't it? What do you think to that?
I think I'm not sure that's quite a straightforward answer. Yes, no. I think I almost see that as irrelevant where it sits. I think the important thing is that it has the right focus and the right attention. So you will know in your organisation whether that works. If you've got an executive team that are on board and are genuinely supportive and championing the agenda, it's almost irrelevant which part of the organisation it sits in. If you are in a business where people are not open to those conversations and the people in the inclusion team are the most kind of up for change in this space, then wherever it's going to make the biggest impact is where I think it should sit. It's a long way of saying that.
Thank you. Sandra Pollock has asked, have you heard about the Black Leaders Network, which is all about working with organisations to promote the development and promotion of Black leaders at higher leadership C-suite levels? And would your organisation be interested in working with and support this initiative? What do you think about this idea?
Sounds great. I will fully profess. I know a lot of organisations, but I don't know that one. So I feel like I've learned something really interesting there, which I'm super chuffed about. So I will definitely be doing more exploration on that after this webinar.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for highlighting that to everybody, Sandra. And then the final one, which potentially we'll see is finished just on time, is what term would you recommend as an alternative to BAME without being exclusive to any minority group? And that is from Amicha. So thank you so much for your input on that, Amicha.
This is a great source of debate at the moment amongst people in my network and my friends, and we've been talking about this at length. I think it depends. I don't think there is just one term. I think it depends on what you're talking about. So if you are talking about understanding your kind of your non-majority employee base, aka your non-white people, either call it what it is, you know, non-white, or ethnicity instead of BAME. You know, some people are comfortable with BAME, and it's a real personal choice thing. There's not a binary it's right or wrong. It's just that I have personally found in professional life it to be an unhelpful term because it kind of clusters a group of people together that are all very different. I am a big fan for calling things what they are. So a black person is a black person, a white person is a white person, a mixed race person is a mixed race person. I think when we can start to talk about that confidently and call people who they are, then, and we get more comfortable with terminology, then I think that starts a richer dialogue and people are then less hesitant to start facing in and having some of these conversations.
Fabulous. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so that's us worked through the questions. The only thing that's left from me is to say, firstly, a massive thank you to you for taking the time out to share your insights. and for our delegates to firstly be a part of this from a listening perspective, but an even bigger thank you for all of the participation that you guys have put into this as well. So we really, really do appreciate it. What we will do as a follow-up is share the recording with you so that you can go back over any bits that are particularly pertinent or that you feel that you've missed today. And in addition to that, I'll share Martin's contact details with you too. I think it goes without saying that he's available on all of the social channels that you would expect him to be on. We will give you those via email as well, and I'll aim to get that out to you ASAP. So thank you again, and you know where we are if you need us, and hopefully we can catch up again further down the line. So thank you so much.